She waited decades to say it, chose the one man she trusted to hear it, and revealed it on live television knowing she would never have another chance. This is the story of the night Joan Crawford sat across from Johnny Carson for what would become one of the most emotionally charged interviews in late-night history. An interview that began like a nostalgic celebration of Hollywood's golden age, but quietly transformed into a confession no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, was prepared to hear. It was late autumn in 1976, and preparations were underway at The Tonight Show for a week of high-profile guests meant to boost ratings before the holidays. Yet behind the scenes, one booking stood apart from all the others, whispered about in hallways and discussed only in closed offices. Joan Crawford had not appeared on network television in years, having withdrawn from the public eye as her health declined and her reputation hardened into a caricature she never publicly challenged. When word came that she had personally requested Johnny Carson, no substitutes, no guest hosts, no pre-recording, the producers sensed this would not be a routine appearance. Johnny himself was briefed privately, told only that Crawford was frail, that the appearance might be her last, and that she had something important she wished to say, though no one knew exactly what that meant. On the night of the taping, the studio carried an unfamiliar tension. The audience filed in with the low murmur usually reserved for historic moments, sensing they were about to witness something weightier than jokes and anecdotes. When the band finished the opening theme and Johnny delivered his monologue, even his timing felt subtly restrained, as though he were pacing himself for what lay ahead. Then, as the curtain parted, Joan Crawford emerged slowly, supported discreetly by an assistant who retreated the moment she reached the light. She wore a tailored dark dress, elegant but understated, her famous eyes sharp yet shadowed by exhaustion, and the audience rose instantly, not in the raucous cheer reserved for celebrities, but in a long, respectful standing ovation that lasted until she gently lifted her hand, asking them to sit. Johnny stood as well, meeting her halfway, taking her hand with visible care, and for a brief moment neither spoke, allowing the silence to acknowledge decades of history between them. Two figures shaped by an industry that demanded performance even when the cameras were off. "Thank you for being here," Johnny said simply, his voice softer than usual, and Crawford answered with a faint smile, "I wouldn't be anywhere else tonight," a line that drew a warm but cautious laugh from the audience. The interview began as expected, with Johnny inviting her to reflect on her early career, the studio system, the rivalries that had since become legend, and Crawford delivered with the practiced precision of a woman who had told these stories many times, her wit still intact, her timing still sharp, though her energy clearly measured. She spoke of contracts that owned actors' lives, of scripts rewritten overnight, of roles won and lost in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken power, and the audience responded with laughter and applause at familiar beats, yet beneath it all ran a current of melancholy, as if everyone sensed these stories were being told not for entertainment, but for closure. Johnny, ever perceptive, did not interrupt when she paused, did not rush when her words slowed, allowing her to dictate the rhythm of the conversation, and it was in one of those pauses, longer than the others, that the evening subtly shifted. Crawford's gaze drifted from Johnny to the audience, then toward the camera itself, lingering there just a second too long to be casual, and when Johnny gently prompted her about a famous role, expecting another well-worn anecdote, she surprised him by deflecting the question entirely. "Before we go any further," she said, her voice steady but quieter, "I need to explain why I asked for you, Johnny, and why I needed this to be live." The studio grew so silent that the faint hum of the lights seemed suddenly loud, and Johnny's expression changed, not alarmed, but attentive in a way viewers rarely saw, the look of a man who understood he was no longer hosting entertainment, but bearing witness. She spoke then about time, about how public stories harden into truths whether they are accurate or not, about how silence can sometimes feel safer than honesty until silence becomes its own prison, and as she spoke, it became clear that this appearance was not about defending her legacy, nor about rewriting history, but about finally telling a version of it she had carried alone. She acknowledged, without prompting, the rumors that had followed her for years, the labels assigned to her, the image of strength that had been mistaken for cruelty, and she admitted that she had allowed those narratives to stand unchallenged because challenging them would have required exposing parts of herself she had spent a lifetime protecting. Johnny attempted once to interject, to lighten the moment, but she stopped him with a gentle shake of her head, not unkind, just resolute, and said, "Please let me finish. This is the part one came for." The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing the threshold had been crossed, that the interview had entered territory rarely reached on television, where performance gave way to confession. Crawford spoke of choices made under pressure, of sacrifices demanded by survival in an unforgiving system, of moments when strength was not a virtue but a necessity. And though she had not yet revealed the full truth she had hinted at, the weight of it was unmistakable. Johnny listened without notes, without jokes, without interruption, his usual ease replaced by a stillness that conveyed respect and gravity, and viewers at home could see that even he did not know where this was going. As the segment approached its midpoint, Crawford's voice faltered for the first time, not breaking, but softening, and she took a breath that seemed to carry decades with it. "There are things," she said, "that follow you your entire life, not because they're true, but because you never corrected them." And with that sentence, the evening's true purpose came sharply into focus. This was not a nostalgic farewell, nor a promotional appearance, nor a plea for sympathy. It was the opening chapter of a truth she had decided, at long last, to speak aloud, knowing there would be no opportunity to explain it later, knowing the world would react however it chose, and accepting that risk because the cost of silence had finally become greater than the cost of honesty. What happened next was not planned, rehearsed, or approved by any producer. And once Joan Crawford began, there was no turning back. The moment lingered in the air as Joan Crawford steadied herself, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the audience, but somewhere far beyond the studio walls, as if she were finally addressing the past itself. Across from her, Johnny Carson remained silent, sensing that any interruption, even a compassionate one, would break something fragile. Crawford spoke slowly now, deliberately, choosing each word with care, and told Johnny that the image the public knew, the cold, unyielding woman, the tyrant behind the scenes, had not been entirely invented, but it had been profoundly misunderstood. "I wasn't cruel," she said quietly. "I was terrified." She explained that in Hollywood's studio era, fear was currency, fear of replacement, fear of aging, fear of being labeled difficult and discarded overnight. Strength, she said, was not encouraged, it was demanded, and weakness was punished without mercy. Over the years, she allowed the studios, the press, and even her rivals to shape her into something harsher than she truly was because that image kept her employed, respected, and safe in a system that devoured women who appeared soft. Johnny finally asked, gently, whether she regretted letting that image stand for so long, and Crawford nodded without hesitation. "Every day," she replied. "But regret is easier to live with than unemployment when you're a woman past 30 in this town." The audience reacted with a low murmur, not disagreement, but recognition, as though many were hearing aloud a truth they had long suspected but never heard confirmed. Then Crawford revealed the reason she had never corrected the record, even when books, articles, and whispered stories painted her as something close to monstrous. She explained that defending herself publicly would have meant exposing the vulnerability of others, young actresses, assistants, and crew members she had quietly helped behind the scenes, people whose careers depended on discretion. "If I had spoken," she said, "they would have paid the price, not me." Johnny's eyes widened slightly at this, and he asked her to clarify. Crawford described, without naming names, how she had used her influence to secure medical care, housing, and work for women who had been abandoned by the studios once they were deemed inconvenient. These were favors never documented, never acknowledged, because acknowledgement would have invited scrutiny, and scrutiny would have invited retaliation. "So I let them call me what they wanted," she said. "It was easier than watching someone else suffer for my honesty." The studio audience sat in stunned silence, the usual rhythm of applause replaced by something heavier, more contemplative, as if everyone understood they were hearing a side of Hollywood history rarely spoken aloud. Johnny struggled to maintain his composure, his voice noticeably strained when he asked why she had chosen this moment, this night, to finally speak. Crawford's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I'm running out of time," she said. "And because if I don't say it now, it will never be said." She acknowledged her failing health without naming it directly, brushing past it as though it were merely another inconvenient truth, and said she no longer cared how the world judged her once she was gone. What she cared about, she explained, was leaving behind something closer to the truth than the legend that had followed her for decades. As she spoke, the emotional distance between performer and audience collapsed entirely. She was no longer a movie star delivering lines, but a woman confessing the cost of survival. Johnny reached for a question card, then set it aside untouched, realizing there was nothing he could ask that would improve upon what she was already giving. Crawford continued, explaining that strength, when misunderstood, becomes isolation, and that she had spent much of her life alone not because she wanted to be, but because the role she was required to play left no room for tenderness. "People think power protects you," she said. "Sometimes it just makes it harder to ask for help." Tears appeared in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away, allowing them to fall freely, unconcerned with appearances for perhaps the first time in her public life. Johnny, openly emotional now, thanked her for trusting him and the audience with something so personal, and she responded with a faint smile. "You listened," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." As the segment drew toward its end, it was clear that this interview had crossed a line few broadcasts ever did, moving beyond entertainment into something raw and deeply human. The audience remained silent until Johnny softly announced the commercial break, and even then, applause came slowly, respectfully, as if clapping too loudly might shatter the gravity of the moment. When the cameras briefly cut away, Crawford leaned back, visibly exhausted yet strangely lighter, having finally released a truth she had carried alone for most of her life. Unaware that what she had just shared would soon ripple far beyond the studio, reshaping how the world remembered her and redefining one of the most unforgettable hours in the history of The Tonight Show. The final moments unfolded quietly, without spectacle, yet they lingered longer than anything said before. As the interview returned from its last break, Johnny Carson did not resume with jokes or light banter. Instead, he thanked Joan Crawford for her honesty, calling it one of the bravest conversations ever held on his stage. Crawford nodded, visibly tired but composed, and said she hadn't come to be forgiven or rebranded, only to be understood, if only for an hour. Johnny stood, walked around his desk, and took her hand, a rare gesture that said more than words ever could, and the audience rose slowly, offering applause that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement. When Crawford finally exited the stage, she paused briefly at the curtain, turned back once, and gave a small, almost relieved smile before disappearing from view. In the days that followed, viewers flooded the network with letters, not arguing over facts, but reflecting on how easily strength is mistaken for cruelty and how often silence hides sacrifice. Years later, Johnny would say that interview reminded him television could still reveal truth when it allowed people space to be human. And though Joan Crawford's legend would forever remain complicated, that final appearance ensured it was no longer one-dimensional, closing her story not with myth or rumor, but with something far rarer, her own voice, finally heard on The Tonight Show.